Hello, my name is Mary Densmore, and I am the Director of Engineered and Industrial Solutions at the American Carbon Registry, and I'm going to be talking today about the work that we're doing to enable and support deployment of CCS projects within the carbon markets. As I said, Director of Industrial and Engineered Solutions at ACR at Winrock. We are an international development organization, and ACR is the carbon markets arm of Winrock. And I really appreciate being part of this large organization that is looking holistically at all sorts of important changes and work that needs to be done across the world, not just on climate, but with definitely a big emphasis on climate. So to talk a little bit about ACR and our CCS methodology, the methodology was initially published back in 2015, and it began work back in 2012, and it took about 3 years to develop that methodology from start to finish. And this methodology is exclusively for enhanced oil recovery. At the time, the majority of projects, which still numbered in not too terribly many, but majority of those projects that were looking to deploy were enhanced oil recovery projects. And so those were the projects we were looking at supporting additionally. Through 2015 and into 2021, when we did our first update, just a small update of the methodology, we didn't generate any credits with the methodology. There weren't a lot of projects deployed, and honestly, there were probably a bit of a disconnect between project developers and the carbon markets at that time. And so in 2021, we received approval under the CORSIA program, the CORSIA compliance program for the CCS methodology, and interest started to increase in deploying projects using carbon markets. We started getting more and more questions from non-enhanced oil recovery projects and users. And so at that point, decided to expand the methodology and the eligibility within that methodology to more markets and more industries, and definitely more reservoirs. So in 2021, as I said, we did a brief update on the methodology, and then in 2022, in November, we released for public comment, and so updated the whole draft with all of the updates that I'll talk about in a little bit. And that went out for public comment for about 60 days to give everybody plenty of time to take a look at the draft. It's about 120 or 130 pages, and so a lot to get through when making comments and reviewing it for the first time. And right now, we are internally going through those many comments that we received and having some consultations with our commenters. So the main purpose of the carbon markets really and this methodology is to demonstrate atmospheric benefits. And so that is being able to show, to quantify, and to demonstrate that a project is, when you look at the project pretty much as a whole, that project is making the atmosphere a better place. And so that is really intentionally drawing boundaries around your project such that any emissions from transportation or energy use are also included, so that when you look at sort of the business as usual for a project, and then you look at that project after it is deployed, what is that difference? What is that net improvement to the atmosphere? And that's how carbon credits are generated. So the purpose of the expansion of the methodology, as I said, is beyond just the scope of enhanced oil recovery, and really to look at additional opportunities for different industries and also in different geologic reservoirs. And so while we're looking at the important atmospheric benefits, and that's how we measure and how we generate tons of CO2 equivalent to actually create the credits, we're also looking at co-benefits, because I said we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're not just solving climate change all by itself. So let's look at those local environmental benefits that might happen due to a project being deployed. Also, the support of infrastructure and the build out of technology and the development of new technologies to do CCS and CCUS better and less expensive and faster. Also, also looks at the support for transition of workforce and some infrastructure, so built infrastructure, and can we convert that some way to important infrastructure that now has carbon capture on it, and then also the tracking of sustainable development goals within our system, so that we see all the other good things that are happening because these projects are being built and deployed. So the sources that we are looking at, and this is not an exhaustive list, these are just some examples that I pulled, and happy to chat about other potential sources of CO2 that are out there. But certainly CDR, carbon dioxide removal, and direct air capture are highlighted more in this methodology than they were in the previous version. The industry has grown. Direct air capture industry has expanded and technology is developing. Those costs are becoming lower and more reachable, and so we can happily support those projects. Also, anything to do with bioenergy. And we have a definition of sustainable biomass within the methodology, the updated methodology, and that can be used as a feedstock for the generation of CO2. That is something that we're really digging into, and there's a lot of interest in all over the world, really, because there's a lot of opportunity within the biomass and the bioenergy space. And so what we have in the methodology is likely to expand either in this version or in the next, just because there's so much opportunity within this space. Also, ethanol production, if it is sustainably sourced, and of course, point source capture at industrial sources, power generation, and other types of manufacturing are eligible in the original methodology and still eligible within this. Looking also at the potential of municipal sources, so waste and wastewater treatment. Those are great places to potentially capture CO2 within municipal sources, and then also really early conversations about the potential to capture from the production of blue hydrogen and blue ammonia. So lots of different places that we can actually be getting our CO2, both from point sources and also from direct air capture and carbon removals. So a big expansion within the new methodology version 2.0 is the geologic reservoirs that are eligible. So that will include saline formations and also depleted oil and gas reservoirs. The original methodology, as I said, was only for enhanced oil recovery, so it was only in active oil and gas reservoirs. So being able to expand into both saline formations and into depleted oil and gas reservoirs really expands the reach of the methodology. There's saline sedimentary formations all over the place that can be used, and depleted oil and gas reservoirs present a really interesting opportunity where they're often pressure depleted, so there's more space within the reservoirs to sequester CO2. So both of those are big expansions, both in the geography and the scope of the methodology. We also specifically call out that offshore reservoirs will be eligible. So be able to go, there's some projects that are already looking in the offshore of the US and obviously in Europe. And so we can support those project deployments as well. One requirement, of course, is that that CO2 must be left undisturbed in perpetuity. And we did get a lot of comments on how to require that and how to enforce that. And it's a tough job, but that's the point of putting the CO2 away, is to really make sure that it's no longer interacting with the atmosphere. And so we need to make sure that it is secure down there and basically can't be disturbed either on purpose or accidentally. And that requires demonstration of access to the pore space that the CO2 is being injected into, and access for monitoring, access for injection, and also just that, again, no one could go in and disturb that CO2 at a later date. We are getting lots of calls to do CO2 mineralization. It's certainly something that we're looking at. It's not included in this round, but we're looking at doing it for a subsequent round of the methodology. Then to speak specifically about EOR, enhanced oil recovery, this is, again, the original methodology, and what we have added is a sunset for EOR projects. They are eligible for 5 years of carbon credits or until January 1st, 2030, at which point the calculations will change a bit. And what's going to change is that we're going to include accounting of the produced oil that comes with the EOR. So those produced oil will be considered process emissions. And so that's the transportation of the oil, wherever it's going from the field to the refinery out to the distribution centers, and then also the actual refining of that oil, which is going to be based on the API gravity of the oil, and then ultimately the end use. So if a company is producing oil and they're able to track and know the mileage of how far it's going to get to the refinery and what the API gravity is, and so therefore the emissions associated with both the refining and the end use, we're able to capture those emissions as part of the emissions that are deducted from the project. And we also include averages in case folks don't know what aren't tracking their oil as quickly. They're just putting it in a pipeline and it's going to the refinery and market after that, and it's not being tracked. There also is regional averages for crude that is exported and also refined product that is exported, and the transportation and then end use of that as well. So the reason we opted to include EOR is because we recognize the importance of the oil and gas industry's technologies and just the help to build out the infrastructure in the shorter term. And we get a lot of pressure on both ends of the spectrum to not include EOR at all, or to include EOR with no limits. And so this is where we settled on and decided to propose in this first round of version 2.0. And as we're going through the comments, getting good support on this here, this sort of level of inclusion, but also accountability. And what it really is meant to do is encourage transition away from maybe the more conventional enhanced oil recovery reservoirs that we're looking to maximize oil production as opposed to CO2 sequestration. And now we can look more at really those transitional reservoirs, those reservoirs that take in and take up more CO2. That now becomes a more important revenue stream, hopefully, than the actual production of oil. So that's what this is meant to do. In terms of ownership, this is both the ownership of the emissions themselves, but also the pore space ownership, because it's key that only one entity is able to take credit for those that generation of those emissions reductions or removals. And so we'll need to see legal language that demonstrates who those emissions really belong to, and therefore who's able to generate and claim those carbon credits. It must be really clearly detailed and defined in a contract so that we can say, especially with CCS, where you potentially have multiple sources that are going into the same pipeline and then into a reservoir, we need to be able to demonstrate that the folks that are generating, the folks that are capturing, the folks that are transporting, the folks that are actually injecting, that they're not all able to take credit for those emissions reductions, that it's just one entity that's able to do it. So we'll need to see both that clear title, but also a chain of custody for who is taking credit, how it's moving through a process, how it's being counted, how it's being measured. And then another important and sometimes challenging aspect of CCS projects is the pore space ownership. We are seeing in the US it being addressed increasingly by state laws, but internationally it is not always clear who owns the pore space and who may own mineral rights if it's in a location where there's oil or gas production, and then who owns the surface rights. So having those three different parts, we really need to make sure that we understand legally who is able to actually say, yes, we can put CO2 in the ground here. I have the right to do that, and I have the right to be able to say that it will stay there forever. For specifically EOR projects, the right to inject and use oil use the oil and gas reservoir is generally part of that lease, but we may need some additional and supplementary language to make sure that that CO2 is really going to be secured in perpetuity. So yes, the right to inject the CO2 is generally comes in the leasing of those fields, but can you demonstrate that no one's going to go in and disturb that? There's also the issue of surface access, and surface rights will need to be able to go out and monitor and measure and make sure that that CO2 isn't reversing back into the atmosphere. It's crucial that we have the access to the surface, so people can go out and make sure that that's happening as well. In order to do this, there are data collection, monitoring, reporting requirements. Some of just the basic monitoring parameters will be, flow rate and how much of that flow is CO2, how much energy, how much fuel, how much fossil fuel or electricity or other energy source is being used. What is it made out of? Particularly for the electricity, we've added some flexibility around how to calculate emissions from that electricity, or if there's steam being used. And then common equipment events like blowing them down for maintenance, where if you have a line that's full of CO2 and you have to clear that line in order to do maintenance, that CO2, if it's released into the atmosphere, that needs to be measured, that needs to be quantified, that needs to be included in the calculations. So that's for certain events that will happen as part of maintenance, or potentially if there's some sort of negative event where something breaks, but also if you have equipment that just leaks, and we have leaking counts of pneumatic devices and that sort of thing. And this is also going to be very specific to each site and each actual capture facility. So this is just a basic example of what it looks like. And then there's going to be, of course, additional monitoring, similar monitoring. That's just going to be for the capture, for the transportation, and then also for the sequestration as well. In terms of just making sure that the measurements are being taken correctly, of course, it's calibrating the flow meters consistent with, use US EPA here, but also industry best practices, and making sure that all the data collection procedures we require that there's a periodic review to make sure that it's being done as best it can. And so we put a plan in place, but also making sure that that plan consistently performs as it is meant to do. And that's part of what's required in the methodology, but also will be required by the third-party verification and validation auditors. In terms of actually doing the quantification, what we will need to know again is what would that baseline have been? So if it's a power plant, how much CO2 or CO2 equivalent would that power plant have been releasing in the absence of carbon capture? Whether that is an existing power plant that is being retrofit with CCS equipment, or it's being built from the ground up, how much would it have been releasing if it was just built conventionally? So what does that look like? And then how much of those emissions are being captured? And then how much is it sort of costing to do that capture? Some of these technologies are very energy intensive. So if a project is releasing 1 million tons of CO2 a year, sort of as its baseline, and then carbon capture is attached, and that carbon capture is releasing another 200,000 a year, that needs to be captured as well, or it's going to be considered a project emission, because that wouldn't be happening unless you were doing the carbon capture. So that net benefit to the atmosphere is really what we're going after. And so the project emission sources can include things like stationary combustion, engines, venting, fugitive emissions, and then again from any energy, electricity, steam usage. And the gases generally that we're looking at are, of course, CO2, but also methane and 2O. And this is pretty consistent with how industry is already measuring most of these things in reporting requirements as well. Permanence is key as well, of course, because you can put it down there, but if it doesn't stay, that's really not very helpful. So that monitoring, reporting, and verification, and with very site-specific monitoring and then the geologic modeling to understand what the behavior of that CO2 will be once it begins to be injected. So the injection begins, monitoring continues throughout the injection period, and then there's the post-injection phase. And what we're really looking for here is plume stabilization. So once injection, certainly watching throughout the injection period, but once injection stops, making sure that that plume is sitting tight down in that reservoir and not moving around. There shouldn't be any inputs at that point to introduce any motion into that plume. So we just need that demonstration in order to sort of close the book on the project. And this comes along with making sure that we understand who ultimately is liable. And I've got a lot of bullets here, but this is something that we're taking a really close look at as part of our version 2.0 in the public comment, because we are looking to broaden the methodology as much as we can. And there's different ways of addressing liability. And in some cases within the United States, there are states that are looking to take on that liability. And so that's something that's going to be very regionally specific. So if you're developing a project, we'll need to understand, is there some requirements around pore space ownership and pore space liability, and how do we make sure that we are capturing any regional variability within that? And what ACR's plan is to basically approve regional locations and say the rules that are in place here, the regulations that are in place in this location are approved by ACR, and we would be able to demonstrate that we're addressing permanence, liability, pore space ownership in partnership with the local governments. Additionality, of course, if it's required that you do these emissions reductions or removals, then you can't get carbon credits for doing them. So that project is additional if it is extra, above and beyond regulatory surplus test. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do CCS, but if there's some requirement that you reduce your emissions by 20% or 50%, you're not able to get those as carbon credits, no matter how you do them. But if you do additional reductions above and beyond that, so for example, if you're required to reduce by 20% and you reduce by 40%, that additional 20% would then be eligible for carbon credits. And also, we're looking at a performance threshold. And so that is basically looking at market penetration. So if you have multiple types of a CO2 source in an area and 50% of them are all doing CCS, we would need to take a look at that, because then it would become sort of standard industry practice, business as usual. We're really, really far from that being a concern here in the CCS industry, but it is something that when we're talking about 10-year crediting periods, because once you sign up, you get 10 years of credits for your project. And then you do another reevaluation after that, and you can renew. After 10 years, hopefully we'll be seeing more CCS projects out there and more programs out there to support it. And so that's when this first round of projects is going to be easier to analyze for additionality, and subsequently, hopefully it'll get more challenging as more projects are deployed. So thank you so much, and happy to take any questions, or feel free to contact me here at Maris Densmore at winrock.org.
Thank you, Maurice, for a great presentation. Now we have Maurice with us. Hi, Maurice. Hi. Well, the ACR methodology has a significant impact on other carbon credit standards all over the world. So we are very much looking forward to the updated version of the methodologies. Well, I'm picking this question. Are you able to expand on where boundaries are drawn for enhanced oil recovery projects? Are emissions from the additional oil extraction included within the emissions boundary? Would you please answer this question, please?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak and share what we're doing at ACR. we are including the emissions from the oil production. The first part is any of the production emissions. So if that is the electricity that's used for pumps to pull the oil up and out, or the CO2 that comes back up as it's cycled through, as it's dissolved in the oil, that's all going to be counted throughout the emissions, and that's current in the EOR methodology. What we are introducing is that sunset and not counting the oil. And so after 5 years since your project start date or 2030, we'll start to include that oil, the transportation, refining, and end use of the oil, and consider that to be a project emission. And that's to really encourage the transition towards reservoirs that are looking to take on more oil and able to take on more CO2, as opposed to production of oil being the main financial driver for this. Great question.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Maurice. I appreciate your contribution to our workshop, and thanks again for joining us such late at night. Okay, thanks a lot.